Today we're going to learn how to make an AI front end with a no-code backend. For this we're going to use Pico apps for the front end. I've got 2 videos on that already, so go check them out. For the backend we're going to use Zano, which is a no-code backend. You can get started for completely free, but once you want the rate limit removed, you'll probably want to go for a paid plan. I will put on the screen a 10% off link that you can use so that when you upgrade you will save 10%. So let's get started. When you come onto Zano, you'll see you've got your database, your API. I don't have time for a full Zano walkthrough here, but it's quite intuitive, and if you want to learn more about Zano, there are a lot of resources on Zano's YouTube channel and elsewhere. But what we're going to be building is a to-do app where the user can also log in and get their own to-do. So we've got a to-do database here, we've got some records with what they've got to do and the users that it's for. Zano also usually automatically sets up API endpoints for you. You can go here on the left, or if you're already on the table, I can go referenced by and I can see the get all API call. So what happens here is we've got our inputs, we've got a function stack and a response. And we can run this API request and let's see what happens. We get all of these getting returned. So the first thing is we want to build an app that can read that data. For that I'm going to copy the API endpoint of this query all records. Let's go back to Pico app. So what we're going to do, we're going to make sure we're on the Pico builder and we get that endpoint URL, and I'm going to say build a to-do list app that calls this get endpoint. The response to the endpoint will be formatted like this, and then when we run that, we could copy the whole lot, but it's I don't want to give Pico apps more data to read than it needs, so I'm just going to remove that comma and put in a square bracket to close it off in correct JSON. Okay, so now Pico apps knows what to call and what the response looks like, so we're going to say display this data in a table, and let's see what happens. Okay, so we have now got our AI to build the front end and connect to our no-code backend. And you can see all of these 6 records have displayed correctly, which is great. But the next thing is we want to have a user login, and maybe they can only see their own records. So here we're going to say create a login pop-up, which is opened by clicking a login button. Okay, now let's go back to Zano and look at how this will work. If we go to our API endpoints, we can go to auth, or basic auth here in this case, and go to the login endpoint. If we copy that endpoint, we can go back to Pico and say to when the user logs in with their email and password, call this post endpoint. The body of this call should be formatted like this. Okay, and then what we're going to do is when we go to run and debug, you can see it wants an email and password to log in. So we're just going to tell Pico apps that as well. And then we can, let's just try this on Zano and see what we get. So we've got bob@email.com, for example, which is a real user on the database, and this is correct kind of login information that is stored. Maybe quickly show you the user table. Okay, so our user tables here, we've got Bob, he's signed up. Okay, so let's go back and we're going to run that, and you can see it's successful. So we also want to copy the response and tell Pico about it. The response to this request will look something like this. and we're going to copy that, and then we're going to say store this returned auth token in the session data. Alright, so let's click update and see what we get. So it's completed generating and we see a login button. So let's try here, bob@email.com, and our password, and let's hit login here. Okay, now we didn't tell Pico to change anything on the front end when we do that, but we can go back to Zano now and go to our login endpoint and go to request history. Okay, so it's this request here, we can see that it came through. Okay, we got Pico apps successfully sent that request, and Zano outputted our auth token. So the next stage would be to do something now that the user is logged in. And of course, what we really want to do is make sure our to-do list only displays the data for the logged in user. So we're going to go to our API and go to our get all endpoint for the to-do list. And here, instead of it being a public endpoint, I'm going to have authentication, user authentication. And then on the query all records, I add a custom query that the to-do's user ID should be the authorized user's ID. That will come from the auth token. We don't need to pass an ID, only the auth token. So I'm going to save that and click on publish. Now what you'll see now is that when we do it, run it inside Zano, it wants an auth token. So if I put Bob as our auth token, we've only got the results for the user, Bob. So now we need to update on Pico and tell it needs to send this authentication token. So next, let's say to Pico apps, when making, please update the get call for populating the table. Add a header in the following format: authorization, bearer, token. And then below we're going to say token is a token is a dynamic variable which will be the auth token that we stored in the session data after the user logged in. Okay, so let's click on update and hopefully this does what we need it to do. Okay, so it's finished here and nothing has been returned. Maybe we can go to our to-do endpoint for get all and see if there was a request there just now, around 53 minutes past. Sometimes there's a short delay, so we can just click here to see if it got called. Okay, it's still nothing. So maybe Pico wants us to log in first before it's even going to load the list. Let's hope that's the case, and let's try with Bob. So let's log in and see what happens. There we go, perfect. It has now returned the details only for Bob. So this is amazing. We've done great already. We've got the user logged in and we're using that data for an authenticated endpoint. Now let's try that a user can add a new task in the to-do list. So what we'll do here, let's go back to API, and under to-do we've got a post add record endpoint here. Okay, now it takes a user ID, but I don't really see why we need to use that, because what we can do instead is put in our user authentication, and then we can use auth ID like we did previously. So in our add record here, for our user ID, instead of using the input, we use auth ID. So this means now we can remove that from, maybe just make it invisible from the API there, because it's not needed. So if we're pressing run in debug, you can see now the request just needs a description, and of course our auth token. So let's copy our endpoint URL again and go back to Pico Apps. Have a field and button for adding a new to-do list record. When the add button is clicked, call this post endpoint. The body of the API request should look like this. Okay, we also need to include our authorization header in this format of authorization bearer token. Token is a dynamic variable which is the auth token stored in the session data. If the API call is successful, the response will look like this. Okay, so again, I'm just going to tell Pico Apps what the response looks like. Will look something like this. Let's try that. Okay, that appears to have finished. Okay, let's try logging in as bob@email.com and the password. And we've now got these tasks from Bob, and let's add a new one. So let's say go for a bicycle ride. Okay, and you can see that got added. So this is really, really good. Next, perhaps we can also have a delete option. So let's go back to Zano. And go to to-do and look for our delete endpoint. And let's do the same again here. Add an option to delete each record. When the delete button is clicked, call this endpoint. Okay, and that is a delete endpoint. Call this a delete endpoint, and you can see it just needs an ID. The body for this API call should look like this. Okay, so let's just test that out. Okay, and it's a success. It doesn't actually return anything, this endpoint. Also, we could add authentication, but I'm not going to bother because it's we don't really need it. But obviously, in a real app, you do want to always have the authentication. So let's click on update. Okay, so it's finished generating. Let's log in as Bob again. And we can see now we've got 4 items and we can delete them apparently. So let's click delete on that one. And on our delete endpoint, let's just see that that came through correctly. 1208, yep. Okay, so it's correctly deleted that record. Okay, and then just check everything else is still working. We can add a new task, etc. So this is looking really good. In fact, this is like almost a complete app. The only thing we're missing is a sign up. We've only got login right now. So let's sort that out too. Go to API and we'll go basic auth and we've got sign up. Okay, so here that is the format with name, email and password. So let's go back to Pico. Next to the login button, have a sign up button. This will go to a sign up pop-up with inputs for name, email and password. So we've copied our endpoint URL, and when the user signs up, this post endpoint is called. The body of this API request will be formatted like this. Okay, and we're going to copy what's there. And then the response of the API call will look like this. Okay, which again, it's same as the login, we just get an auth token back. This auth token that is returned should be stored in session data. So let's try that. Okay, our app has finished generating, so let's try our sign up. Nathan3 at nathan.com. It's important to note that on Zano, by default, you need a strong password. So have capital letter, numbers, letters, and some kind of punctuation. Okay, so hopefully I'm signed in now. Let's try adding a task. So make new video. Now the record ID looks correct, so let's check our database, see if we've got that new record. There we go, we've got a new to-do record for a brand new user. So this is amazing. This is like a really complete app now. The only thing we really need is a logout. So if the user is logged in, I guess auth token in session data is not empty. Don't display the login and sign up buttons. Instead, display a logout button, which when the logout button is clicked, the auth token in the session data is removed, and the user is logged out. Let's see if that does the job. Okay, so interestingly the logout button is there, so I'm going to click that first before trying to log in as Bob. Okay, the login didn't work that time, which is kind of strange, so Let's try and make a new bob. And that did work. So let's add a task called hello. That looks correct because the ID adds up. Goodbye. Delete, delete. Okay, log back out. Let's sign up with another bob. Wash the dishes. Okay, so as you can see, the app is really quite complete. I think there might be an issue with the login endpoint now. No, there's not. That seems to work, although there's a duplication there. That's probably just due to the way it's loading the data. There won't be a duplication on the database. But anyway, that's yeah, hopefully a really good introduction for you guys about how you can have an AI front end with a no-code back end. Don't forget, if you do want to try Zano, to use my link for 10% off the price. If this was interesting for you, feel free to like and subscribe, and leave a comment if you have any questions about maybe how you'd like to use Zano, or maybe about Pico apps or Adalo, which if you look at my channel is what most of my content is about.